All right, let's dive deep today into Luke 5, 1 to 11. You know, the miraculous catch of fish, right? We know you're probably already familiar with this one. It's a pretty popular passage, especially for us pastors and Bible study leaders. But we've gone through a whole bunch of sermons and interpretations, and we found some pretty unique angles on it. So get ready to maybe steal some sermon ideas, huh? We won't tell.
Well, it's amazing how many pastors are still finding fresh inspiration in this story, you know? It just shows that even those passages we think we know inside and out can still surprise us.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's cast our nets into these sermons and see what we pull up. One of the themes that kept popping up was this whole idea of obedience leading to overflow. But it wasn't that simple, just do what you're told kind of obedience.
hmm
There's definitely more nuance to it.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of the sermons actually emphasized the progressive nature of obedience. It's not just about blind obedience, right? It's about taking those initial steps of faith, even when they seem small or insignificant, and then trusting that God will lead us to bigger blessings.
You know, the blessings through obedience sermon really stood out to me. The preacher made this really interesting parallel between Peter's decision to obey Jesus and the military leaders who made the call to drop the atomic bomb.
Wow, that's quite a comparison.
Yeah, right.
But I see where he's going with that. It illustrates how those huge decisions, the kind that change the world, often come from a series of much smaller choices. Each step of obedience, no matter how tiny it might seem, can have these ripple effects. And those ripple effects go way beyond what we can even comprehend at the time.
Right, it's like a chain reaction. Then there was the transforming emptiness sermon. That one really grabbed me with this concept of God margin. The preacher used the image of the empty boat as a symbol of creating space for God to work. It's about making room for God in our lives and in our ministries, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's like, think about Peter's boat. It was empty. It was a vessel waiting to be filled. And then God filled it miraculously with abundance. So the preacher's suggesting that we need to intentionally create that same kind of emptiness in our own lives. It's about making space for reflection, for prayer, for just listening to God's voice. You know, it's about letting go of that need to control everything and just allowing God to fill those empty spaces with his presence and his power.
That's a powerful image. It's like a challenge to look at those areas in our lives where we're crowding God out, where we're trying to do everything ourselves instead of relying on him.
Exactly. It's a call to be more receptive, to be open to God's leading, even when it takes us out of our comfort zone.
Okay, so moving on. Another theme that came up in a few sermons was this idea of moving beyond just being a fan of Jesus
Mm.
and actually becoming a true follower. It's not enough to just admire Jesus from a distance.
hmm
It's about letting his teachings radically transform our lives.
Yeah, there was one sermon, From Fans to Followers, that used a really striking analogy. It compared being a fan of Jesus to just catching a glimpse of a deer in the woods. You know, it's a nice moment, but it's fleeting. True discipleship, though, is more like being burned by a campfire. It leaves a mark, a lasting impact that shapes who we are.
Ouch. I like that. Very vivid. And the radical surrender sermon took this idea even further by exploring what it really meant to follow a rabbi in the first century.
Right. It wasn't just about attending a weekly class or something. It was a complete life change.
Yeah, I mean, discipleship in that context meant giving up everything, your job, your home, even your family, to follow your rabbi and learn from him. It was total commitment.
It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it, when we think about what it means to follow Jesus today?
That's a good question, actually. How do we translate that kind of radical discipleship into our modern world?
It's tough, for sure. But maybe it starts with asking ourselves some tough questions and asking those same questions of our congregations, too. What are we really willing to sacrifice for Jesus? Where are we holding back? Are we clinging to comfort and security instead of embracing that radical call to discipleship?
It's a call to really examine our priorities, isn't it? To see how deep we're willing to dive into this life of faith.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond the shallow end, you know, and venturing into the depths where real transformation happens.
Now, of course, we can't talk about Luke 5, 1 to 11 without talking about the fishing analogy
Mm.
and how it relates to evangelism, right?
Mm.
A lot of the sermons we looked at used that metaphor,
hmm
but some of them got pretty creative with it.
Oh, yeah, they did. Transforming lives was a good one. The preacher really focused on the persistence and dedication that you need when you're fishing for people. You know, it's not just about casting your net and hoping for the best. It's about those long hours, the early mornings, the patience it takes to reel in a catch.
Yeah, that's a classic approach.
Yeah.
But there were some sermons that went beyond that typical casting the net metaphor. Called to Deeper Waters was interesting. It seemed to take a more nuanced view of evangelism.
Oh, that one was great. The pastor actually used this phrase, fishing at PetSmart to kind of critique that ineffective evangelism that only targets people who are already in the church. Like, you're not really fishing if you're just scooping fish out of a tank, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I get it. It's a good point. It's easy to get comfortable just preaching to the choir, so to speak.
Exactly. We need to be casting our nets into wider waters, reaching out to those who are truly lost and searching for something more.
And I heard the pastor even used music in his sermon.
He did. He collaborated with his daughter, who's a rapper, to create this whole song about deep waters to illustrate the message of the sermon. I thought it was really cool. It just shows that sometimes those creative, unexpected approaches can really connect with people.
I love that. It's a reminder to be open to new ways of communicating the gospel. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. Some of the sermons also focused on this more serious side of discipleship, the sacrifices involved in following Jesus, the cost, so to speak.
Yeah, the sermon, The Cost and Reward of Following Jesus, was a good one. The pastor used this personal anecdote about his surprise at encountering taxes when he moved to North America. He came from a country that didn't have taxes. And he used that to illustrate those unexpected costs that sometimes come with following Jesus.
So it's not always smooth sailing, huh? Sometimes there are those unforeseen challenges, things we have to give up, expectations that get overturned.
Right. It's not always easy, but as a lot of the sermons pointed out, the rewards are immeasurable.
It's a reminder that discipleship is a journey, and it's a lifelong journey, filled with both joys and challenges. And as pastors and Bible study leaders, it's our job to prepare our congregations for both.
Absolutely. We need to be honest about the sacrifices involved, but also emphasize that incredible power of God's grace and those amazing blessings that come with walking this path of faith.
Okay, one last thing before we wrap up this part. I noticed that several sermons really made an effort to ground Luke 5:1-11 in its historical context.
Oh yeah, that's so important.
Why is that?
Because understanding the historical and cultural background of a passage can unlock so much meaning, meanings that we might miss otherwise. For example, in the Transforming Emptiness sermon, the preacher explained the fishing practices of the Sea of Galilee, the types of nets they use, the fact that they typically fished at night.
And that detail about fishing at night, that makes Jesus' command to fish during the day even more striking, right?
Exactly. It really highlights how radical obedience is and those unexpected ways that God works. Another sermon, Blessings Through Obedience, pointed out that fishing was the main source of income for a lot of people in that region. So when Peter and the other disciples left their nets to follow Jesus, they were basically abandoning their careers, their financial security, their whole way of life.
It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a huge leap of faith.
Absolutely. And that understanding can really change how we see their commitment and the sacrifices they were willing to make.
It reminds us that following Jesus isn't just about agreeing with his teachings in our heads or having some kind of emotional experience. It's about a lived faith that affects every single part of our lives.
And that's a message that's just as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, exploring themes of obedience, sacrifice, discipleship, the power of encountering Jesus. But there's still so much more to unpack.
Oh yeah, we've only just started to cast our nets into the depths of this amazing passage.
Stay tuned. As we continue our exploration of Luke 5:1-11 in part 2, we'll delve even deeper into the nuances of this story and uncover even more insights that you can use to inspire and challenge your congregations.
Coming back to this passage, what really strikes me is expert speaker.
Yeah.
How it connects the physical and the spiritual so beautifully.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you've got the nets, the boat, the fish, but then you have this incredible encounter with the divine.
It's true. It's like those everyday objects and experiences become these powerful symbols.
Right.
They point us to these deeper truths about faith and obedience and the nature of God.
Yeah, and notice how the story unfolds. Jesus starts by teaching from the boat, and then he shifts the focus to the actual act of fishing. It's like he's saying, okay, you've heard the words, now let's put them into practice.
Yeah, it's a call to action. And it's Peter's response that always gets me. He's tired, he's frustrated, probably ready to pack it in for the day. But when Jesus tells him to let down the nets again, he says, because you say so, I will.
There's so much packed into that statement, like a mix of doubt and surrender.
Right.
It's like Peter saying, I don't get it, but I trust you.
And that trust is rewarded in the most amazing way. The nets are overflowing so full they start to break.
It's this incredible picture of abundance, of God's limitless provision, And it also foreshadows the abundance that Peter will experience later on as he follows Jesus.
And you know what else is interesting? A lot of the sermons pointed out that this wasn't just some random act of kindness from Jesus, this miraculous catch. It wasn't just about giving Peter a good day's work.
Right, it was about something much bigger.
It was about revealing God's power and glory, drawing Peter into a deeper understanding of who Jesus really was.
Exactly. It's about revealing his true identity.
And that understanding led to a radical transformation in Peter's life. He went from this experienced fisherman to a humble disciple,
It's a beautiful transformation.
recognizing his own flaws, his sinfulness in the presence of God.
And that's the heart of it, isn't it? It wasn't just about catching fish, it was about catching hearts.
Going through these sermons, I was struck by how many emphasized the cultural context of this passage. Sometimes I think we forget that these stories are rooted in a specific time and place, with different social norms and expectations than what we have today.
That's so true. It's crucial to remember that. For instance, the Radical Surrender sermon talked about the importance of fishing in the first century economy. It was how many people survived. So for Peter to leave his nets behind, that was a huge decision.
It wasn't just symbolic, it had real-world consequences.
Exactly. And that adds another layer of meaning to the story. It shows how much faith Peter had in Jesus. He was willing to risk everything, step into the unknown, because he believed it was worth it.
And that challenges us, doesn't it? What are we willing to risk for Jesus? Are we content with this comfortable, compartmentalized faith? Or are we willing to let it permeate every part of our lives?
That's the question, isn't it? And speaking of cultural context, the From Fans to Followers sermon really focused on the rabbi-disciple relationship in first century Judaism.
Oh yeah, that was a fascinating one.
It really highlighted how intense that relationship was. It wasn't just about listening to lectures. It was about total immersion in the rabbi's way of life.
You lived with your rabbi, observed everything they did, memorized their teachings.
Right, you were striving to become like them. It was about transformation, not just acquiring knowledge.
Which brings us back to that idea of moving beyond being a fan of Jesus to becoming a true disciple.
It's not enough to just admire his teachings.
It's about letting them shape our thoughts, our actions, our whole being.
It's about surrender, about embracing his values, letting his spirit work through us.
It's about becoming more like him in every way.
Exactly.
And, we've been focusing a lot on Peter's experience here, but there are other characters in this story, too.
That's right. We can't forget about them.
We have James and John, the sons of Zebedee. They also leave their fishing business to follow Jesus. And then there are the crowds witnessing this incredible miracle, filled with awe and wonder.
It's a reminder that this story isn't just about Peter. It's about all of us who are called to follow Jesus.
As pastors and Bible study leaders, we need to help our congregation see themselves in this story.
I agree.
We can all relate to that feeling of being overwhelmed, doubting ourselves, wondering if we're good enough.
But this passage shows us that Jesus sees us, he calls us, and he empowers us. He empowers us to do things we never thought possible.
It's a message of hope, of transformation, of the incredible power of obedience.
And that message is just as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago.
As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm amazed by how much this passage has to offer.
Me too. It's really incredible.
We've explored obedience, faith, sacrifice, cultural context, the power of encountering Jesus.
It's been a rich and rewarding journey so far.
But we're not finished yet.
There's still more to uncover.
Stay with us, because in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore how this seemingly simple story about fishing can speak to some of the deepest truths about our faith. Through all these sermons and different interpretations, what keeps sticking with me is how deep this passage really is. Like, it's a well we can keep drawing from, and there's always something more to discover.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's amazing how such a simple story on the surface can be so rich and complex.
I think that's part of why it still resonates with us today,
Absolutely.
centuries later, and it's still speaking to us.
And these preachers, they really picked up on that.
Yeah, one thing that stood out was how many of them focus on the smaller details of the story. The little things that we might easily miss. But those details, they actually have some profound insights tucked away in them.
Oh, definitely.
Like the transforming emptiness sermon, for example.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
The preacher talked about how Jesus was teaching from Simon Peter's boat, a borrowed boat. And he used that detail to talk about how God often works through our limitations, through the things we offer to him, even when they seem insignificant.
It's a good reminder that we don't have to have it all figure out to be used by God, right?
Right, exactly. It's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about surrendering what we have to him, even if it seems small or inadequate,
Mm.
trusting that God can multiply it for his purposes.
Just like those loaves and fishes. Exactly, a small amount, but it fed thousands.
And then that ties back into that idea of God margin, doesn't it? Sometimes it's in those empty spaces when we feel most vulnerable, most ill-equipped. That's when God does his most amazing work.
We got to make room for the unexpected, you know? Leave space for the miraculous to happen.
Okay, another detail that got me thinking
Yeah.
was that Jesus told the disciples to fish during the day.
Yeah, and as we learned, that wasn't exactly standard fishing practice.
Right.
Most fishermen cast their nets at night when the fish were easier to catch.
So from a human perspective, Jesus' instruction was kind of illogical, right?
Totally. Some of the sermons even pointed that out.
It's like he was setting them up for failure in a way, testing their faith.
But because they obeyed, even though it didn't make sense, they experienced this abundance beyond anything they could have imagined.
Yeah, that's amazing. It reminds us that God's ways are higher than our ways. And sometimes he calls us to do things that just don't make sense to our human logic.
Definitely.
It's a powerful lesson in the power of obedience, even when it's hard, even when we don't understand.
It can lead to incredible blessings.
Speaking of those blessings, I think it's worth coming back to that fishing analogy for a second, how it connects to evangelism. We talked about it before, but there's definitely more we can unpack there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's such a powerful image, but it's also easy to overuse it or even misapply it, you know?
Totally.
One sermon that offered a first perspective was Called to Deeper Waters. The pastor actually used different types of fishing to illustrate his point.
Okay, I'm interested. Tell me more.
He talked about shallow water fishing, which doesn't take much effort and you don't usually catch a whole lot.
Right, like just dipping your toes in.
Exactly. And then he compared that to deep sea fishing, which is way more challenging, but also has the potential for a much bigger catch.
Oh, I see where he's going with that. He's saying that sometimes we get comfortable fishing in the shallows, right? Our own social circles, our comfort zones, our routines.
Exactly.
But Jesus calls us to launch out into the deep, to go to those places where people are really searching for meaning, for purpose.
Right. It takes a different level of commitment, a willingness to take risks, face challenges, step into the unknown.
It's about leaving those comfort zones behind, embracing the adventure of faith.
And it's not always easy, is it?
No, it's not.
Following Jesus comes with a cost, as we talked about.
Yeah, there are sacrifices.
Things we might have to let go of, relationships we might have to reconsider, comfort zones we definitely have to leave behind.
But the rewards are beyond measure.
Absolutely. When we answer God's call, we experience a level of fulfillment, a sense of purpose that nothing else in the world can offer.
We become part of something so much bigger than ourselves.
Something that has the power to change lives, including our own.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Luke 5:1-11, I want to leave you with this question. What is God calling you to leave behind? What do you need to surrender? What step of faith is he asking you to take?
It might be a small step, something that seems insignificant.
But it could be the beginning of an incredible journey.
Remember, you don't have to have all the answers before you take that step.
Just be willing to say, because you say so, I will.
That's the key.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained some new insights and inspiration from these sermons and interpretations.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep diving deep into the riches of God's Word.